At exactly 11:42 p.m., a video appeared online that should never have existed. Most people scrolled past it. Some watched in silence. And a few realized too late that they were looking at the opening move of something far worse. Police believed this was just another disturbing upload. They were wrong. This case would not be defined by a single crime scene. It would involve multiple countries, thousands of unwilling witnesses, and a person who didn't just want to kill. He wanted to be seen doing it. This case stayed one step ahead of investigators for months, not because evidence was missing, but because the most important detail was right in front of everyone. By the end of this story, you'll understand how the truth surfaced online before it ever reached law enforcement, and why that didn't stop what came next. The city was ordinary. Apartment buildings stacked tightly together. Side streets lined with parked cars. Neighbors who recognized each other's faces but rarely spoke. Life followed a routine. Work, school, late dinners, quiet nights. Nothing about this place suggested it would become the center of one of the most disturbing investigations in modern history. And nothing about the person at the center of it drew attention. At least not yet. Late one night, a video surfaced on a popular internet platform. It wasn't promoted. It wasn't trending. It wasn't meant for a mass audience. At first glance, it looked amateur. Poor lighting. No dialogue. No explanation. But what it showed was unmistakable. Two kittens, and a methodical act of cruelty. There was no rush. No visible distress from the person behind the camera, just deliberate movement. Within hours, the video was flagged and removed. Authorities were notified. The incident was categorized as animal abuse, a disturbing crime, but not uncommon enough to raise alarms beyond that, at least not officially. While authorities moved on, a small group of internet users did not. They weren't investigators. They weren't journalists. They were ordinary people who noticed something off, not about the violence itself, but about the presentation, the framing, the stillness, the lack of hesitation, and most importantly, the decision to upload it at all. This wasn't someone trying to hide. This was someone testing attention. At the time, that detail was dismissed. Later, it would become impossible to ignore. Criminal psychologists would later agree on one point. This behavior wasn't impulsive. There was no sign of panic, no loss of control, no emotional collapse. This was controlled behavior. The camera placement was intentional. The timing was intentional. The upload was intentional. This wasn't about anger. It was about dominance and reaction. The person behind the video wasn't just committing violence. He was studying the response. Weeks passed. Then another video appeared. This time, there was no ambiguity. The violence was worse, more deliberate, and unmistakably escalated. The internet reacted immediately. Forums erupted. Screenshots were taken. Copies spread faster than moderators could remove them. Authorities were contacted again. The same conclusion was reached. Animal abuse. Disturbing, but disconnected. Still, no sense of urgency. And that hesitation would cost time. But the most disturbing part was still to come, because the person behind the videos wasn't finished. He was learning. As officials hesitated, online communities mobilized. They analyzed reflections in the video, electrical outlets, vacuum cleaners, shadows, language patterns in comment sections. Nothing was too small. They weren't driven by curiosity. They were driven by fear, because everyone understood one thing. Cruelty like this does not stop. It evolves. Names surfaced. Accusations spread. Innocent people were targeted. Lives were disrupted. The internet's strength became its weakness. Too much information. Too little verification. Meanwhile, the person they were searching for watched quietly and adjusted. Then something changed. A message appeared. It wasn't anonymous. It wasn't subtle. It referenced the investigation itself. Referenced the attention. Referenced control. This wasn't someone hiding from exposure. This was someone inviting it. And with that message came a promise. Another video. This time, involving a human being. When the next upload appeared, there was no confusion. No debate. No doubt. A man was dead. The camera captured the act, the aftermath, and the calculated presentation of evidence. This wasn't violence for release. This was violence as performance, and it was meant for the entire world. Within hours, international law enforcement agencies were involved. Airports were alerted. Borders were flagged. Digital records were examined retroactively. The internet had predicted this moment. Authorities were now reacting to it, but the person responsible was already gone. Packages began arriving, to government buildings, to schools, to political offices. Each contained the same message, and pieces of the same body. There was no attempt to conceal identity, no attempt to avoid detection. This was a statement, and it worked. Experts would later explain. This wasn't rage. It wasn't loss of control. It was exhibition. The killer needed acknowledgement. Silence would have been failure. The arrest had not happened yet. The name had not been revealed. And the most unsettling truth hadn't surfaced. Because investigators were about to learn something far worse. This wasn't the beginning. It was the middle. By the time authorities understood the scale of what they were dealing with, the person responsible was already moving. He wasn't running blindly. He wasn't frantic. He traveled calmly, crossing borders with the confidence of someone who believed the story wasn't over yet. Airports circulated alerts. Hotels were contacted. Digital footprints were traced backward, but the trail kept going cold. Because he wasn't hiding. He was watching. News outlets flooded the airwaves. The story spread across continents. Every update, every theory, every leaked detail. And somewhere, the man responsible read all of it. Investigators would later confirm he followed the coverage closely, not anxiously, not defensively, with satisfaction, because the attention confirmed something important to him. He was in control of the narrative. Despite months of planning, the arrest didn't come from advanced profiling or clever surveillance. It came from routine, a quiet moment, a public place, in a cafe, in another country. An employee noticed something familiar, a face from the news. A man calmly seated, using a public computer. No disguise that Anno Rush. Police were called, and when they arrived, he didn't resist. He didn't run. He didn't deny who he was. The performance had reached its final act. Officers approached carefully, weapons drawn, commands issued. He complied immediately, hands raised, body relaxed. Witnesses later described something unsettling. He smiled, not broadly, not nervously, but with quiet awareness, as if he had been expecting this exact moment, because in many ways, he had. In the interrogation room, investigators prepared for volatility. They expected anger, fear, deflection. What they got instead was composure. He sat upright, made eye contact, answered questions politely. Too politely. He corrected investigators when they misspoke, asked about legal procedures, commented on how long the process might take. This wasn't shock. This wasn't regret. This was participation. From the beginning, psychologists noted something unusual. He wasn't overwhelmed. He wasn't emotionally flooded. He showed no physiological signs of stress. Heart rate steady, breathing controlled, voice even. This wasn't emotional collapse. It was emotional detachment, and more importantly, it was performative. When evidence was presented, he didn't argue. When details were read aloud, he didn't flinch. He confirmed facts, clarified timelines, explained methods, not to help investigators, but to ensure accuracy. Because to him the story mattered, and he wanted it told correctly. But the most unsettling moment didn't come from what he said. It came from why he said it. During questioning, he frequently redirected conversations, asked investigators what they thought of the case, commented on public reaction, mentioned online discussions. This wasn't accidental. Criminal psychologists later explained. Even after arrest, he sought dominance. The interrogation room was just another stage, and he was determined not to lose the spotlight. As investigators examined his past, patterns emerged. A childhood marked by instability, repeated reinvention of identity, a hunger for validation. He exaggerated achievements, fabricated stories, created personas, each one designed to attract attention. When admiration faded, he moved on, until admiration wasn't enough anymore. Experts pointed out a critical trajectory. The acts increased in intensity. The documentation became more polished. The audience grew larger. This wasn't random violence. It was structured progression. Each step designed to push limits further, to see how much attention each act would generate, to measure reaction. Investigators faced a difficult reality. The audience mattered, not because viewers caused a crime, but because they completed it. Every click, every share, every discussion, to him, attention equaled success. Silence would have been failure, and that realization would haunt the case. Psychiatrists evaluated him extensively. Their conclusions were precise. This wasn't uncontrollable rage. This wasn't psychosis. This was calculated behavior driven by extreme narcissistic traits, desire for notoriety, emotional detachment, manipulative tendencies. He understood right and wrong. He simply didn't care. What mattered was recognition. As the case moved to court, behavior remained consistent. He appeared composed, occasionally smirking during testimony, watching reactions closely. He didn't look at the victim's family, not out of shame, out of disinterest. His focus stayed fixed on the room, on the attention, on the moment. But the most disturbing realization was still ahead, because experts began to question something deeper. During evaluations, one question remained unresolved. Would he have stopped if he'd never been noticed? Psychologists disagreed. Some believed escalation was inevitable. Others believed the attention accelerated it. Either way, the result was the same. A life lost, and a line crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. When sentencing arrived, the courtroom fell silent. Victim impact statements were read. Pain was described. Loss articulated. The weight of what had happened was undeniable. When asked if he had anything to say, he spoke briefly, not to apologize, but to comment on how the case would be remembered. Even then, the narrative mattered more than remorse. He was sentenced to life. The public exhaled. The danger was over, but the story wasn't, because the real impact of this case hadn't fully surfaced yet. And what it revealed about attention, violence, and responsibility would linger far longer than the sentence itself. By the time the trial opened, the case was no longer confined to court documents. It was everywhere. Television panels debated it nightly. Headlines competed for the most shocking phrasing. Online discussions fractured into arguments, theories, and blame. The courtroom wasn't just a place of justice. It was a stage. And the man at the center of it understood that better than anyone. When he entered the courtroom for the first time, observers noticed the same pattern investigators had seen months earlier. He scanned the room, not nervously, not defensively, deliberately. His eyes moved across journalists, attorneys, spectators, taking inventory, measuring reaction. This wasn't fear. This was awareness. Every gesture was analyzed, every facial expression frozen in screenshots. Commentators debated whether his demeanor revealed arrogance or detachment, but the effect was the same. Attention multiplied, exactly as he had engineered it. Criminal psychologists later described this phase as reinforcement. The attention didn't cause the behavior, but it validated it. Prosecutors understood the danger. They avoided theatrics, limited exposure to graphic material, focus on facts, timelines, evidence, intent. Their goal wasn't outrage. It was clarity, because clarity stripped away the performance, and that threatened the one thing the defendant valued most. The defense attempted a different approach. They raised questions about mental health, implied loss of control, suggested emotional disturbance, but something undermined those arguments. The planning, the documentation, the decisions made before, during, and after each act. This wasn't confusion. This was execution. But the most disturbing manipulation didn't happen in court. It happened outside it. While awaiting trial, letters began circulating. Not official statements, personal writings, some sent to media outlets, others to individuals involved in the case. Each one carefully worded. Not confessions, not apologies, narratives, attempts to reframe events. to recast himself as misunderstood, as central, as unavoidable. Investigators intercepted many of them, but not all. Experts noted a troubling detail. Even in confinement, stripped of freedom, he continued to exert influence through language, through suggestion, through story. This wasn't desperation. It was persistence. He didn't need physical access to manipulate. He needed attention. Journalists face an ethical dilemma: ignore the case and risk accusations of minimizing harm, cover it extensively and risk amplifying the very behavior that fueled it. Some outlets chose restraint, others did not, and the result was fragmentation, conflicting narratives, selective focus, and a growing sense that the truth was being drowned out by spectacle. Amid the noise, one presence was almost erased: the victim, a young life reduced to headlines and evidence tags. Family members sat through proceedings quietly, rarely shown, rarely quoted. Their grief did not fit neatly into the cycle of outrage and commentary, but in the courtroom it carried weight, unavoidable. And then something unexpected happened, something that shifted the emotional center of the trial at a critical moment. The court allowed a limited presentation of evidence, not the most graphic material, but enough to remove abstraction, enough to silence the room. The details were precise, methodical, unmistakable, and for the first time, the performance cracked. Observers noticed a change, a tightening of posture, a break in eye contact. It didn't last long, but it was there. Psychologists later explained, this wasn't remorse. It was loss of control over the narrative. For someone driven by dominance, that mattered more than judgment. Jurors were instructed to ignore media coverage, but the case followed them everywhere. They focused on evidence, on planning, on intent, on escalation, and gradually, the picture sharpened. This wasn't chaos. It was design. When the verdict was read, there was no reaction, no visible relief, no visible anger. He nodded slightly, as if confirming an outcome he had already anticipated. The story, in his mind, had reached its next chapter, but the verdict wasn't the end of his influence. In some ways, it was the beginning of a different kind. After the trial, public opinion fractured. Some felt closure, others felt complicit. Online communities that had once searched for answers began questioning themselves. Had attention accelerated the harm? Had exposure given him exactly what he wanted? There were no clean answers, only discomfort. Experts warn of something else. Cases like this don't end with sentencing. The narrative persists through documentaries, through discussion, through fascination, and each retelling risks repeating the cycle. That awareness forced a hard question. How do you tell a story like this responsibly, without feeding the very motive behind it? The court had spoken. The sentence was final, but the impact was just beginning, because beyond the verdict lay something hard to confront. What this case revealed about attention, about spectatorship. When the courtroom emptied for the last time, there was no sense of relief. There was quiet, not the kind that signals resolution, but the kind that follows something irreversible. The person responsible was locked away. The public danger was over, and yet the unease remained. Because this case hadn't just exposed a crime, it had exposed the system. Away from headlines and speculation, there was a life that never got to continue. A student, a son, a person with plans that will never be realized. In court documents, he was reduced to timelines and evidence, but outside the courtroom, he was remembered by those who knew him as ordinary, kind, and entirely unprepared for what happened. That contrast is what made the case unbearable for many. There was no connection, no warning, just collision. For the victim's family, grief unfolded under observation. Every update reopened wounds. Every documentary resurrected details. Every retelling carried the risk of erasure, where the killer's name overshadowed the person who died. They asked for restraint, for focus, for dignity, and in doing so, force an uncomfortable reckoning with how these stories are told. Online communities that once raced to uncover the truth began to slow down. Some members left entirely. Others stayed, but with guilt. They questioned their role, not in causing crime, but in shaping its reach. They had identified patterns, predicted escalation, warned authorities, and still it hadn't been enough. The realization was heavy. Being right doesn't always mean being able to stop what's coming. And that led to the most disturbing question of all. Experts debated it endlessly. Some argued the trajectory was inevitable, that the violence would have escalated regardless of audience. Others believed the tension accelerated the timeline. That reaction rewarded behavior. That silence might have delayed or changed the outcome. There is no definitive answer, only probabilities. And in cases like this, probability is cold comfort. Behind closed doors, agencies conducted reviews. They acknowledged missed opportunities. Animal abuse cases, once treated as isolated incidents, were reclassified as potential warning signs. Digital threats were taken more seriously. Interagency communication improved, but progress came at a cost, because reforms often arrive after harm, not before. This case entered textbooks, training programs, academic papers. It became an example of something modern criminal behavior had fully embraced. The audience matters, not as a cause, but as fuel. The crime wasn't complete until it was seen. And that realization changed how investigators, psychologists, and media professionals approach future cases. Inside prison walls, the environment is different. No cameras, no commentary, no audience. Reports suggest behavior changed once attention diminished. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The story had ended, and without it, there was nothing left to perform. But the question lingered. True crime exists to inform, to warn, to understand. But this case challenged the genre itself. At what point does awareness become amplification? At what point does curiosity serve the wrong purpose? And how do we remember victims without extending the reach of those who harmed them? There are no simple rules, only responsibility. Years later, the case is still referenced, not for shock value, but as a caution, a reminder that modern crime doesn't just happen in shadows. It happens in public view, sometimes by design, and how we respond matters more than we like to admit. This wasn't a story of a monster hiding in darkness. It was a story of someone who wanted to be seen, and a world that didn't know how to look away. The most disturbing part of this case isn't what happened, it's what it revealed. Do you believe this crime was driven more by the need for recognition, or by something that would have surfaced regardless? What responsibility, if any, do audiences carry in cases like this? If you're interested in psychology and stories behind real crimes, and understanding what they reveal about us, subscribe to Behind the Crime Files, and about the thin line between awareness and amplification.